A young mother wrongfully convicted of murdering her son. A victim of forensic error and societal bias. Incarcerated for nearly 14 years for a crime she did not commit. An innocent woman labeled a baby killer. A young mother wrongfully convicted of murdering her son. This is the story of Tammy Marquardt.
May 18th, 1991.
A young 19-year-old, Tammy Marquardt, gives birth to her first son, whom she names Kenneth. With Kenneth's father out of the picture, Tammy is now both a single mother and teenaged mom. Motherhood has its surprises for Tammy, and soon she discovers that Kenneth is not as healthy as she thought. Kenneth begins experiencing a variety of serious health struggles. These struggles include asthma, pneumonia, and epilepsy. As a result of this, Kenneth is hospitalized several times due to the intensity of the seizures accompanied by his epileptic episodes. Epilepsy is a common neurological disorder that affects people of all ages. It is characterized by unpredictable seizures and can cause other health problems.
October 9th, 1993.
Now at 21 years of age, Tammy puts 2.5-year-old Kenneth down in her spare bedroom so that he may take a nap. Thinking her son is calling out to her, Tammy goes to check in on Kenneth and finds him distressed, tangled in the bed sheets, and struggling to breathe. Unable to free him, Tammy calls 911 and is instructed to perform CPR on her son. In a state of panic, Tammy is unable to calm herself down enough to perform CPR. Ambulances arrive and rush Kenneth to the hospital. Doctors are able to resuscitate him, but unfortunately the brain damage experienced is irreparable, and after 3 days, he is taken off of life support. Tammy agrees to allow doctors to harvest his viable organs for donation purposes. Tammy is now left to grieve the loss of her son, 2.5-year-old Kenneth. Kenneth's autopsy is conducted and examined by pediatric pathologist Charles Smith. In 1993, Charles Smith was the director of the Ontario Pediatric Forensic Pathology Unit at the Toronto Sick Kids Hospital where Kenneth was taken. He is a renowned, reputable, and a highly respected pathologist who was the leading expert in the suspicious deaths of children. Despite Kenneth's previous struggles with his health, his prior hospital visits and medical struggles are ignored. After the autopsy is performed, Charles Smith concludes that Kenneth's death was caused by asphyxiation as a result of strangulation or smothering.
November 23rd, 1993.
Not even 2 months after the passing of her son, Tammy Marquardt is arrested and charged with the second-degree murder of her son, 2.5-year-old Kenneth. Tammy is taken to Whitby, Ontario, and is tried for the second-degree murder of her son, Kenneth. Charles Smith appears in court as an expert witness and testifies that Kenneth's death, as shown in the autopsy, was due to asphyxiation as a result of strangulation or smothering. The Crown argues that Tammy strangled Kenneth in a moment of frustration. To the Crown, Tammy had much to be frustrated about, given her background as an impoverished, single, and young mother. Smith's autopsy also displayed red spots on Kenneth's organs that were not donated. These red spots are referred to as petechial hemorrhages, and they occur when there is a minor bleed from broken capillary blood vessels. This led the Crown to believe that Tammy did indeed strangle her son based on Charles Smith's autopsy. Tammy maintained her innocence, and the defense argued that Kenneth's death was due to an epileptic seizure which he had experienced several times prior to his death. However, the defense counsel does not call in an expert witness as the Crown was able to call in Charles Smith. The Crown also used the testimony of several workers for Children's Aid to support Smith's theory. The jury agreed with the Crown's theory.
October 24th, 1995.
Tammy Marquardt was officially convicted of the second-degree murder of her son Kenneth and was sentenced to a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole for 10 years.
January 22nd, 1998.
3 years after being incarcerated, Tammy appealed her conviction to the Ontario Court of Appeal, and the appeal is quickly dismissed. She was unable to obtain further financial support from Legal Aid Ontario, and therefore was unable to push her appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. While in prison, Tammy gives birth to 2 more children who were stripped away from her upon birth by Children's Aid and are placed into the foster care and adoption system in Canada. Tammy names these 2 children Keith and Eric. A representative from Aidwick writes a letter to the Crown of Ontario's Ministry of Attorney Generals requesting that they release Charles Smith's autopsies of his past patients who were children who died in criminally suspicious ways. At this time, Aidwick were requesting an inquiry into Charles Smith on behalf of William Mullins Johnson, who was a man wrongfully convicted of murdering his niece, as an autopsy conducted by Charles Smith indicated. Since the late 90s to the early 2000s, Charles Smith began garnering negative attention and was slowly losing his reputation as people became suspicious of the results of his autopsies. This suspicion pushed Aidwick to take a look into cases where autopsies were carried out by Smith and where he testified in court as an expert witness. In 2004, Tammy wrote a letter to Aidwick asking for help with her case, and in 2005, Aidwick wrote another letter to the at-the-time Chief Coroner for Ontario and the at-the-time Attorney General asking for a public inquiry into Charles Smith. The Googe inquiry was an inquiry into the criminally suspicious child deaths where Charles Smith performed the autopsies and testified in court as an expert witness for. It was used to discredit Charles as a pediatric pathologist in Ontario. The inquiry was conducted by Stephen Googe, and he found that Charles Smith was responsible for misleading jurors in court by providing false statements. On October 23, 2008, the Ontario government put in place the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service, as prior to this, Canada allowed doctors to conduct autopsies without board certification. Charles Smith was not certified to conclude the findings of asphyxia as he did in the case Kenneth. Following the Googe inquiry, it became apparent that allowing sole doctors to conduct autopsies and to determine a cause of death was not as practical and accurate as it was once thought to be. Now, autopsies are conducted in teams and are reviewed to ensure verification before being officially declared. Dr. Pekka Sauko, who is a Finnish professor of forensic medicine assigned by the chief coroner to review Kenneth's autopsy, found that Smith's official ruling of Kenneth's death as an autopsy was
illogical and completely against scientific evidence-based reasoning.
And that
there is not sufficient evidence for the diagnosis of asphyxia to be made. It cannot be based only on petechial hemorrhages of thymus, pulmonary pleura, and epicardium, which are non-specific findings. The cause of death should be given as unascertained.
He also explained that at the time of Tammy's preliminary hearing, Charles Smith's actions and manner of conducting himself in court were highly unprofessional and misleading to the jurors.
Smith has been stripped of his medical license to practice by the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons today. He was a no-show in front of the discipline panel, but he sent his lawyer to plead no contest to charges of professional misconduct and incompetence. The college found that he had no proper training to be conducting the autopsies on suspicious child deaths between the years 1981 and 2001, and that his testimony that sent many innocent people to jail was erroneous.
February 10th, 2009.
Aidwick brought forward an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada on behalf of Tammy, which Tammy had wanted to do previously but was unable to do so due to her financial situation at the time. The appeal was granted. Tammy Marquardt was released from the Grand Valley Institution of Women, which was a women's-only prison in Kitchener, Ontario. At this time, she had spent nearly 14 years in prison. Despite this, Tammy's name was not yet cleared, as she was released on bail until her new trial on February 10, 2012. Before the time for the new trial could come, in June of 2011, the Crown dropped the second-degree murder charges laid against Tammy. Tammy was released as a result of the findings in the Googe inquiry, which showed that Charles Smith had misled the jury on what the actual findings of Kenneth's autopsy were, and that Kenneth did indeed die as a result of the seizures in his final epileptic episode, in which he was tangled in his bedsheets and suffocated, and that these epileptic seizures faced from infancy to early childhood are a result of inborn errors of metabolism, which Kenneth appeared to have. Tammy suffered nearly 14 years in prison for a crime that did not happen. She lost her son Kenneth and her 2 other children she conceived afterwards, who were taken away by Children's Aid and put up for adoption. She has stated that she wishes to make contact with her 2 sons, who were adopted out, but understands that they are now settled into their own lives and wants them to be the ones to reach out to her. Now, in her 40s, Tammy is settled in Toronto with her fiancé Rick and their 9-month-old daughter Tiffany. Tammy also recalls the many horror stories she was a part of while serving her time in prison as a convicted baby killer. Tammy was given $250,000 Canadian in compensation for her being wrongfully convicted. Tammy Marquardt was a perfect target to be wrongfully convicted. She conceived her son, Kenneth, in her late teenage years and was a single mother who was impoverished and on welfare. Tammy was also on her father's side, Anishinaabe, making her 1/2 Native American. She was a small woman, standing at 5 foot 0 inches tall and 85 pounds at the time of her arrest. The Crown used her background as a young, single, impoverished mother to portray the image that she was an unfit mother with basic coping and parental skills. The Crown's main argument was that Tammy strangled Kenneth out of frustration, which had to do with her own inability to cope with her financial and failed relationship situations. In Canada, Indigenous persons are a marginalized group and are primarily stereotyped to be lazy substance abusers and unfit persons. Tammy's race may have played a role in the jury seeing her as an unfit mother, as not only was she 1/2 Native American, but she was also impoverished. In many wrongful convictions, there is a pattern of viewing those who are impoverished as unfit parents, especially women. A woman's role, as seen in North American society, is that of a domestic role, in which the woman is responsible for taking care of her house, husband, and children. Tammy had an unstable relationship with Kenneth's father, who for the majority of Kenneth's short life was not present. Tammy also deviated from the norms of what a woman with a child should be. She wasn't financially stable and therefore was deemed an unfit mother, so the theory of her strangling Kenneth out of frustration and anger is not far-fetched from this standpoint. The jury was painted an image of her where she was drawn out to be this woman who was unable to care for her son and had difficulties in her own personal life. The societal bias against Tammy and factors of her own individual background worked in tandem to discredit Tammy in the eyes of society and in court. There are 4 main causes of Tammy's wrongful conviction. 1. Societal bias surrounding Tammy's race and maternal norms. As mentioned previously, Tammy's background as an impoverished single teen mother, paired with her status as being half Indigenous, was enough for negative stereotypes in society to be presented in court, forming a bias against her. She deviated from maternal norms and was therefore seen as an unfit mother, so her strangling her son out of frustration was seen as likely by the jury. 2. Charles Smith's forensic errors in conducting Kenneth's autopsy. Charles Smith was a respected pediatric pathologist in Toronto, and only with the Googe inquiry did the truth about his medical misconduct come out. He misled the jury in regards to Kenneth's autopsy and gave a false testimony as to the cause of Kenneth's death. As an expert witness in court, the jury was more likely to believe him when he stated that Kenneth's death was caused by asphyxiation through strangulation rather than through an epileptic seizure, and this theory was only further accepted through the Children's Aid workers who also testified agreeing with Charles Smith. 3. The defense counsel's lack of a medical expert witness of their own to prove that Kenneth had experienced several seizures prior to this and that this was a likely cause of death. Kenneth's previous medical history was brought up by the defense counsel, but they were unable to back this up as Tammy did not have the financial means to obtain an expert witness of her own, whereas the Crown had this access and was able to secure Charles Smith. Kenneth's medical history was not brought up again in the court hearings. 4. Tammy's lack of financial means. Tammy's lack of financial means to hire better lawyers and expert witnesses gave the Crown the upper hand in being able to obtain Charles Smith to testify his false findings in Kenneth's autopsy. Her financial limitations also kept her from being able to further apply for an appeal with the Supreme Court of Canada when she was dismissed by the Ontario Provincial Court of Appeals.